remember when I was in 8th grade, that was the first time I knew a story I had written was well, I said good at the time. I was terribly excited about it. And the teacher read it in class as an example of a good story, and I was just thrilled beyond words. And I was always writing something, it seems like. But then there was a long period of time, well, when I got my first degree, my Bachelor of Arts, it was in English, and I had done a lot of short story writing in my English classes. So basically I got a degree in writing, which of course didn't do me much good. So I also had a degree in secretarial practices, which was, you know, you could be a teacher or a secretary or a nurse, and that was pretty much it in those days. There were other, but basically those were the things that young women did. And I only worked for a few years, and then my husband and I were married, and then we had children, and then, you know, it's the whole story of what it used to be, the stay-home mother in the old days. But then the youngsters were all grown, and they were off in college or doing their own thing. We had 3, a boy or a girl and 2 boys. And I decided I was going to be bored sitting at home, so I decided that I'd get a temporary job. Well, the temporary job led to more of a full-time job, and my children were appalled because I was being a secretary again, and of course by then women had been liberated, and being a secretary was not what they felt their mothers should do. I don't know why I still think secretaries are wonderful and terribly necessary and much more intelligent than and necessary, oh, so necessary, than people believe. I think they're wonderful. But my children didn't want me to be a secretary. So they got together, and one Christmas gave me a gift of any class I wanted to take at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, which simply appalled me. I had not been back at school since I was graduated. All of my children were on honor rolls. I had one at the University of Nebraska, our daughter down there, a son at Wesleyan, and another son who was just finishing high school, Westside High in Omaha, and was preparing for college. And all of them were on the honor roll, and the idea of trying to compete with that was the most, I mean, I smiled and told them I thought it was wonderful, and I'm thinking, what am I going to do? I cannot go back to school. I cannot do this. It's terrible. So when I got to thinking about it, I thought, I know, I had heard about auditing classes. So I told my children that I was going to audit the classes so that I could use the extra money, because it was cheaper to audit, to buy the books, because I knew that they wouldn't want me to use family money to buy the books with, which of course was bending the truth a bit. I simply didn't want to be in competition, and you don't get graded when you're auditing. Turned out there was a woman professor named Susan Rozowski who was teaching a class. And so I thought, well, I would call her and see what her class, it was about women in the West or something like that, see what her class was going to be. And so I called her, and she was just marvelous on the telephone, and she was full of excitement and enthusiasm, and she was just the kind of a person that you say, yes, I want to be exposed to this person and what she has, because she was so exciting. And so then I happened to be talking to a friend, and she said, oh, you're not taking one of those women's classes? And I said, well, yeah, I thought I was going to. She said, oh, you can't do that. She said, you know, they're all just a bunch of bra burners. And I thought, well, I didn't really think that lady sounded like it was going to be that wild a class, but I said, well, I was going to try it, and if I didn't like it, I always had the other one. Well, I went to the first class and knew that this was what I wanted, and changed my class, of course, and got into that one. Between Sue Rozowski and the enthusiasm for her class, the enthusiasm for the young women who were in that class, who were so excited about what they were doing and what they were learning, and how they could express themselves, it was a fantastic class. Sue Rozowski influenced my writing. I think I had been writing poetry by then for a while, but I hadn't shown it to anyone. I showed it to Sue, and she was very positive about it, which gave me a good sense of the fact that I was heading in a direction that I like too. But she also taught me that I was using too many adverbs and that I wasn't writing tightly enough, and that was what she would say on my papers. I gave her a paper that was perhaps 5 pages long, and she gave me 8 pages of constructive criticism on this. It was incredible. And she told me to rewrite my paper. And this was the end of the semester. This was later, of course. I enrolled for other classes of hers. And then I decided I would go ahead and get my master's degree because she said she wouldn't help me enroll any further if I wouldn't work on my master's, which I, as with Aldridge, said I didn't want to have a master's. But she said, you need to go ahead and get your master's degree. So, okay. In the meantime, I had got a job there at the university as a secretary to the dean of the CBA, and so I was taking these classes free, and that was nice too. But when I enrolled for my master's, then I quit my job and went in at full-time and began teaching part-time. So anyway, she got me to the point where I could write a much better story or article or paper, whatever it was. She is just superb. I can't say enough about what she has done for me and hundreds of students. Certainly not a planned progression of any kind. At one point when I was standing with some other faculty at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and somebody was talking about Willa Cather and another was talking about Mari Sandoz, and I said, why doesn't anybody ever talk about Bess Streeter Aldrich? Well, now I had not read Bess Streeter Aldrich since I was young, and I didn't really know anything about her except the name rang a bell as being a Nebraska writer. So they said, we'll talk, and I said, obviously I can't. But then things just kept happening. Mrs. Aldridge just kept getting in my way. And as she bothered me, I had to take one more step into learning about her. And it was just such a gradual unfolding. And finally, I was at the Bess Streeter Aldrich Remembrance Day in Elmwood, Nebraska, which is held every first Sunday in October. And they had asked me if I would be the speaker the following year and give a talk about Lantern in Her Hand. And my response was, as it had been to all of these things that kept happening prior to that, was that no, I really didn't think I could do that. And they said, well, we'd really like to have you do it. And I thought, there's no real reason I can't. This is just very odd. So I said, all right, I would do it. So I gave the review the following year or a discussion, it wasn't a review, a discussion of Aldridge's probably best known book, which was Lantern in Her Hand. And afterwards they came up, the board of directors came up and asked me if I would write a biography about Mrs. Aldrich. And I used my usual, no, thank you, I really don't feel that I can. I'm what you might call a late bloomer. I didn't get my PhD until just a few years ago. And I had, at that time, I knew I was going to be writing, but I was interested in fiction, and I had a novel about a third of the way done, and I felt that that's what I wanted to use for my dissertation. But then I thought it was really kind of rude of me to have said no, because I did think at that time that somebody else was already writing a biography. So that was part of the reason for my no. And then I thought I really ought to find out if somebody was, and so I checked with the press, and the person who had been no longer was. And I thought about it for a few more months and thought, well, nobody had written a biography about Mrs. Aldrich. She was an outstanding writer. She has never gone out of publication, and she needed it. So I thought I would try, and that's how I got started doing it. And the more I got into Bess Streeter Aldrich and her works, the more I admired Mrs. Aldrich and her high qualities, her high ideals, and so that was how that all got started. Many people think that when you say you're an editor, that you're changing words or you're changing how the story is written or worked out or something like that. Editing in this sense is not that kind of thing. Editing in the sense that I am doing it is reading the stories, preparing the stories, finding the original stories, which sometimes was a bit of a treasure hunt because many of them had never appeared before in a collection. So I had to find them and then read them and then try to put them together in a proper form. Now basically these are being put together in a chronological order, but so many of them have ties either to a previous story or to a subsequent story under another title in a totally different way. But they also have ties to some of her novels. And so what I have done is go through and make a sort of a master chart of her stories and try to find themes or maybe subplots, subtexts that run through there, and put those as paragraphs that precede the story. There have been times when I really felt that my phrases, when I would write, because I didn't just start writing with Mrs. Aldridge, I've written since I was in grade school, that some of my phrases were practically echoed by things that she said, or maybe it was the other way around since she came first. So there was a certain element of a similarity in styles, not totally and only occasionally, and I suppose this could be true with anybody that you were interested in and wrote about. You would find some similarities of your style in that style. When I was writing the biography, I felt very much her presence, and it was specific to the point that I felt like she was back of my left shoulder and watching what I wrote to make sure that it was factual, because everything that Aldridge wrote was as factual as she could make it. She did tremendous amounts of research. So I also did tremendous amounts of research. There are many, many feet of Aldridge material at the Nebraska archives, and I went through every inch of those feet and through every paper inside of every inch. And everything I have put in there, as far as I know, is factually true, because I didn't think I could let Mrs. Aldridge down from all of her work and making sure everything was right. She said it snowed on January 17th, 1889, it snowed that day. And so I sort of felt I had to continue that accuracy, which is one of the reasons her books have been used in history and social studies classes, because of their factualness. She does say that she has one point that isn't necessarily true, but she said put that down to poetic license. In one of her stories, she has a wedding scene, which actually was the wedding scene of her mother in the early days. And the lady comes down, the bride-to-be comes down the ladder from the loft upstairs, comes down into the main room of the cabin. And when she arrives, there are, to make things pretty, there are rows of love apples, according to Aldridge, sitting along the kitchen window wall. And she said, now I know at that time that love apples were no longer, or that tomatoes were no longer called love apples, and that we weren't worried about them or anything like that, because people used to think they were poisonous. But she said it was so much nicer to say that it was a row of love apples sitting in cans than it was a row of canned tomatoes sitting there.
Let's welcome Carol Miles Petersen.
I have a great deal of respect for Bess Streeter Aldrich and for her work and for the way in which she carried on, despite the fact that her husband died when she had 4 children who were not even in high school, well, not even through high school. The oldest daughter, Mary Eleanor, who lives still here in Lincoln, was 14 years old, but the youngest was only 4 at the time, and there was no way that she could simply wave a magic wand and have financial help. Nowadays we have a lot more financial help. I have a lot of respect for her because she continued to work and she put her children through college, every one of them. She wasn't at all sure she would be able to write after her husband died, but she did, possibly, probably, because she simply had to. Now, to start with, in the collected short stories, and the second volume will be out probably in '98, spring of '98 is what we're hoping for, and that will take the books from, this goes to 1919, That will take the stories from 1920 to 1951, which is the time of her last story. We decided to do it that way because originally we had thought about making 3 volumes, but 3 volumes would encompass the Masons and the Cutter stories and Journey into Christmas stories, and it didn't seem quite the thing to do. So, because if you had one of those books and bought these and they were repeated, that didn't seem quite right. So this is what we're doing, and so I'm in the process of choosing the stories to put in the 2nd volume. It is not an easy task because I want this one because I like it so well, and I want that one because that's such a good example of her humor. And then, of course, this one really has to go in there, and so it's just been very difficult. There will be one short story from the Mother Mason series that will appear in the 2nd volume of the short stories, and that's the one about it's the Junior Mason story. And I think it is such a fine example of her sense of humor and her understanding of youngsters, particularly boys. Having had 3 of them, I'm sure she did know them quite well. But it's just a fun and funny story. And I said we just have to have this one because it's just a prime example of Bess Streeter Aldrich. But let me go ahead and start reading to you from my introduction, which will tell you a lot about Mrs. Aldridge. In describing how to write a short story, Bess Streeter Aldrich noted the author must, quote, live the lives of its characters, crawling into their very skins. He must be an actor. More than that, he must play all the parts, unquote. In playing all the parts, Bess Streeter Aldrich brought to her readers the pleasure of well-written stories that reflect her own personality, her positive outlook on life, her humor, her understanding of people. The stories further offer the pleasure of recognizing characters and incidents that reappear in Aldrich novels. The revised Mason and Cutter family stories became the books Mother Mason and The Cutters, and Zimri Streeter appears as Grandpa Statler in the 1950 story of that name. He was also Uncle Judd in The Rim of the Prairie, and he was also Jeremiah Martin in Song of Years, which is about Iowa. He is also the hero of the 1944 short story Soldier Vote of 64. In Soldier Vote of 64, she was, of course, talking about 1864. The character of the school teacher in The Madonna of the Purple Dots, which she wrote in 1907, and in The Cat on the Mat, Cat is on the Mat in 1916, appears as that of the protagonist in The Rim of the Prairie. She wrote often about teachers. Many of these stories are reprinted for the first time since their original publication. I have included in this volume 2 that were sold but not published. One, The Madonna of the Purple Dots, because the magazine went out of business, and the other, Concerning the Best Man, because of an editorial policy change in the magazine that purchased it. Aldrich wrote more than 100 short stories and was able to claim the enviable record of never writing a story she did not sell. This is an incredible record. Many of her stories were syndicated after the first publication, and many were sold to British magazines. Her readership was enormous. All of her novels remain in print. This is not in the book, but just as a, excuse me, as an aside, you have to be a very good author for your books to remain in print as long as hers did. This book contains stories that Aldrich wrote from the start of her career through 1919. That year, she turned 38 and had accomplished a great deal, both in her personal life and in her writing. After graduating from college in 1901, she taught for 3 years, received a second teaching degree, married, moved 3 times, bore 3 children, and was pregnant with her 4th child, was active in church work, organized the first women's club, and helped start the first public library in Elmwood. She also wrote and sold 26 stories plus miscellaneous articles by the time she was 38, all of which demonstrates the truth of a comment in 1920 by one of her editors that hers, quote, was a case of stored-up energy. It certainly was, unquote. Bessie was her given name. Bessie Genevra Streeter was born in Cedar Falls, Iowa on February 17, 1881. She was the youngest of 8 children. With 10 years separating Bess from her nearest brother and 14 from her nearest sister, Bess learned to rely on her own reading and her own imagination. for entertainment. She said that characters she met in books became as familiar to her as the neighbors. Reading, reading meant curling up in a large, friendly armchair in the living room, or tucking a book under her apron as she went upstairs in the mornings, ostensibly to make beds. She would tell her mother that she was going to go, this is an aside also, she would tell her mother she was going to go make beds and slip a book under her apron. And with a large family as they had, because only one child did not move in from the farm to Cedar Falls when the family moved in, when most of the family moved in. So she had all these beds to make, and she could spend the entire morning up there with the book. She'd read for a while, and then she'd hurry up and make a bed, read for a little while, and go in and make another bed. And I'm quite sure her mother knew exactly what was going on, but she let her do it. At any rate, now I've got to find my place. I have in here, I say, she could read then until somebody began to wonder where she was. Favorite authors included James M. Barrie, whose humor she enjoyed, and Charles Dickens, whose characterizations she appreciated. Her work has a running thread of laughter, much as Barrie's does, and many people have commented on the fact that her characters are very much like Charles Dickens, very fully done, very, very well done. Along with her personal favorites, there was the Bible, a staple of her Scots Presbyterian family. From it, she learned the moral, and from her mother, too, she learned the moral principles by which she would live and which her writing would reflect. She also learned Bible verses, which occasionally surface in her novels, rephrased but with cadences intact. She also uses an occasional biblical phrase, King James Version, in her short stories, and you pick them up. It's usually a surprise when you see them in there, but they are there. Relishing stories as she did, Bess began creating her own, sometimes in the playhouse that her father had built for her in the backyard. Probably from about the age of 9 on, and using a lead pencil, as she always would when she wrote stories. She would write, when she would use a lead pencil for first drafts. Bess wrote fanciful stories. She knew, even as a child, that, quote, when words are put together, they're just like singing, unquote. Also, in the playhouse, pedaling with furious speed on a broken treadle sewing machine, she transported herself on adventurous journeys. Playing with neighborhood friends, she wove tales of exciting balls, beautiful gowns, handsome knights with their ladies. One of her friends was the nearby little girl, Grace Simpson, and she recalled how Bess would begin telling a story peopled by herself and all of her friends, all of her listeners. She would describe the setting, the dazzling people, and her own exquisite dress. Then, turning to Grace, or one of the other children, of course, but to Grace particularly, she'd say, "All right, Grace, it's your turn now." And Grace, lacking the flowing imagination, would respond, "Oh, I don't know, Bess, you tell me." And so Bess would make up whatever Grace was wearing, too. And I think, and she also did that for the other children, in all likelihood, Grace Simpson was reincarnated as Josephine Cutter's friend, Effie Peterson, in Josephine Encounters a Siren, which was a 1922 story. Bess won her first writing prize, a camera, at the age of 14, later admitting, it was, quote, "It was then I first tasted blood, for the intoxication of seeing my name in print was overwhelming," unquote. At 17, she entered a contest with a story she later described as, quote, "heavy as a moving van. It oozed pathos. It dripped melancholy," unquote. It won $5 for her, which she used to purchase a showy umbrella, which she thought made her look sophisticated, and which would later appear as a humorous object in her writing. She used that several times in various stories. As it turned out, it was a bright red umbrella, and her sisters said they certainly thought she got her money's worth with it. She wrote articles throughout her college career at Iowa State Normal School, which is now the University of Northern Iowa, and from which she graduated in 1901. She then went on to teach at Boone and Marshalltown, and then 1 year in Salt Lake City, Utah. She returned to Cedar Falls in 1906, working as assistant supervisor of the primary department on the equivalent of her master's degree, which she received the following year. While she taught and worked on her second degree, she wrote articles and published children's stories and had a story accepted for publication just before she was married. Now, I did not include in this volume of her collected short works, I did not include the children's stories because I thought they were not they were good, but they were for children. Most of the people who would be reading this would not be interested in a 2-page child story about Mr. Squirrel or something, but little kids learning to read would really have enjoyed them. After her 1907 marriage to attorney Charles Sweetser Aldridge and their subsequent move from Cedar Falls, Iowa to Tipton, Iowa, she found little time for writing. She was learning to be a housewife and a banker and attorney's wife. In 1909, the Aldridges, their 2-month-old daughter Mary Eleanor, Bess's mother, and her sister Clara and brother-in-law John Cobb moved to Elmwood, Nebraska, where the Aldridges and the Cobbs had purchased the American Exchange Bank. For the next 2 years, Aldridge spent her time as wife and mother and became an active member in her new community. Then, in 1911, she saw an advertisement in the Ladies' Home Journal asking readers to send in stories. This was for a contest that the journal was sponsoring. Aldridge's desire to write surfaced again. The next few afternoons, while the baby napped, Aldridge wrote her story. She took it to the bank to type. The bank had only one typewriter at the time. And when one of the clerks needed to use that one and only typewriter, Bess took out her story, waited until he was done, and then sat down to pick out the letters again until the next interruption. She, of course, did not know how to type either. The contest attracted more than 2,000 entrants, apparently exceeding what was anticipated, for the magazine dropped the contest idea and instead purchased 6 of the stories. Aldridge's The Little House Next Door was one of those 6. When the $175 check came, her mother, who was living at the Aldridge home at the time, said, "Look again, Bess, it must be $1.75. But it was indeed $175. Oops. Bess Streeter Aldrich then began the transition from occasional to full-time author. With the excitement and impetus of this important sale, she began immediately on another story, sandwiching writing time between the tasks of caring for her husband, her children, and her home. She explained, quote, that the blood that had come from the people who crossed the Mississippi on the ice with oxen began to assert itself, and I determined that if keeping at writing constantly would eventually land one somewhere, I would begin writing in earnest. From that time on, I had a manuscript on the road, unquote, almost constantly. The next story, she said, quote, wandered around from magazine to magazine, making 23 trips before it found an editor who would buy it, and it brought only $20, unquote. Because some of her stories went out so often, they became dog-eared, and Aldridge would retype the first and last pages to create the impression that the story was on its first trip. She said she was, quote, selling one just often enough to encourage me, unquote. I thought that was such a clever idea, and how much nicer to send out a fresh-looking copy. I really enjoyed Mrs. Aldridge. I mean, she was just a neat lady. In order to sell, Aldridge knew she had to work on the... First, let me put in one other thing before I go on with this. When she was talking about her writing and about how she started that second story right away, she said, why, when she finished it and reread it, it was so much better than the first, and she knew it was going to be more than $175, and she thought maybe this one would be $200, and she mentally had the money spent, and it came back, and it said it was rejected, and she said, then I learned my lesson. You have to work at learning to write just as you have to work at learning to be a grocerman or anything else. Writing is not easy. So that was one of her early lessons in writing. In order to sell, Aldridge knew she had to work on the details and techniques of writing. Thus, she did whatever gave her the opportunity to practice. She entered and won a few newspaper contests, submitted a recipe to Armour Cookbook that was accepted, sent a couple of comments to the Delineator, which was a well-known magazine of the time. She received $1 for each one of those. She wrote some other miscellaneous materials, only 2 of which are included in this collection. The first one is called My Life Test, and the second is How I Knew When the Right Man Came Along. She loved to get into contests, and these both were contests. These both have the Aldridge cadence and character types, and to the best of my knowledge, they are written by Bess Streeter Aldrich. However, they were published anonymously, and no conclusive evidence proving or disproving that they are Aldrich's has come to my attention. Both are recorded in her financial journal, in which she put every story, every sale she ever made. But since there were quite a few stories with each of the, because it was a contest or because people were asked to submit this kind of material, who knows for sure, but I truly believe that I have put in only Aldridge material. Every acceptance, whether it garnered $1 or many times that amount, was recorded in Aldridge's financial journal. In 4 years, she had earned a total of $638 for her writings. Only 3 sales had exceeded $100. So you can see how much she was doing, just nickel and diming, as one might call it. She continued to work at her craft by taking correspondence lessons from a writing school whose director told her that inasmuch as she already had some success in publishing, he would take her on as his private pupil and read her work himself. It was not long, however, before he told her that she was a born writer and that her work was so good that there was little he could do to there was little he could teach her, although he would be glad to continue to read and critique any material she might choose to send him. Acceptance for her work continued to increase. In later years, she would tell people that his was a very fine school if they wanted to learn to write a little bit. So, the year 1918 was an important one for Aldridge. Until this time, describing it as a form of writer's print fright, much like an actor's stage fright, Aldridge had written as Margaret Dean Stevens, which was a combination of her grandmother's names. She was now confident enough to use Bess Streeter Aldrich. Proof of her increasing success came in 1918 when McCall's accepted The Box Behind the Door, and the People's Home Journal, another solid magazine of the time, bought Their House of Dreams. The letter from the American magazine for Mother's Dash for Liberty, that was the $175 one, must have been the most exciting acceptance of all, since the journal had published The Little House Next Door, which had been back in 1911. Aldrich felt that this sale was her turning point, for she had long been trying to break into the highly respected American magazine. And they had rejected her stories for over 5 years. And other magazines, such as McCall's, had accepted those the American had rejected. So you know she was writing good material, but that tells you how high the standard was for the American. The American reflected the optimistic ideals of its editor, John M. Siddall, who chose only well-written and upbeat stories. Evidently, Siddall understood his subscribers quite well, for by November of 1919, the American's paid circulation was over 125 million. That is tremendous. Now, that's only paid subscribers. How many people read beyond that 125 million? I think they figure something like 3 people for every subscription. So she had a tremendous audience. Mother's Dash appeared in the December issue, and shortly thereafter, a soldier stationed in Germany, this was, you recall, right after the end of World War I, wrote that his buddies had worn out his copy of the American because Mother's Dash reminded them so much of home and their own mothers. He asked for more of these stories. Aldridge already had the next one at the editor's office. In 1920, which, by the way, is believed to have been something of a first for Aldridge, because there had never been a family series, as far as is known, to appear previous to this in any of our magazines in this country, and I don't know about overseas. In 1920, her 4th and last child was born, giving Bess and Charles 1 daughter and 3 sons. Fortunately, Charles gave Bess, quote, help and encouragement, pressed her to take more time for writing, encouraged her in every way, unquote. Continuing to find the time to write was not easy, however, and she struggled with obstacles. She said, quote, I wrote when the meals cooked, when babies tumbled over my feet, and while I was ironing in the old days. The hand that rocked the cradle was often the left one, while the right was jotting down a sentence or two. I've had the first draft of many a story liberally sprinkled with good old sudsy dishwater, unquote. Nor did the writing itself necessarily come easily, and Aldridge speaks of, quote, walking the floor, unquote, much as you would walk the floor with a sick baby. And in doing so, she reveals how, for her, the private and the professional, the domestic and the literary, were one. Not surprisingly, Aldridge's principles for her fiction were those by which she lived. Her writing must be acceptable to everyone, she determined. Her stories are about decent people saying and doing decent things. There is no swearing in Aldrich stories, no sex, no divorce, None of the seamy side of life. Indeed, decent and seamy are Aldridge terms. She wrote, quote, "Why quarrel with a writer over realism and idealism? After all, an author is a glass through which a picture of life is projected. The picture falls upon the pages of the writer's manuscript according to the mental and emotional contours of that writer. It is useless to try to change these patterns. If one writer does not see life in terms of dirt, grime, and debaucheries, it is no sign that those sort of things do not exist. If another does not see life in terms of faith and love, courage and good deeds, it does not follow that those characteristics do not exist. I claim that one may portray some of the decent things about him and reserve the privilege to call that real life too," unquote. By similar principles, Aldrich chose to write of domestic rather than political conflicts. As a granddaughter, a wife, and a writer, she knew of war. During the Civil War, her grandfather, in his 60s, had gone to Atlanta to bring the soldiers' votes back to their state to be counted in the 1864 presidential election. And because all contact with the North had been shut off, he had to endure with Sherman's troops the terrible march to the sea. Her husband had served in the Spanish-American War and had almost died. And Aldrich wrote and published stories during World War I. War was the single topic for which Aldrich expressed unequivocal hatred, and in her own way she devoted herself to eradicating it. As if willing a future free of war, she joined others in believing that World War I would end all wars. And as if erasing it from the present, she expunged it from her fiction. The Rosemary of Remembrance, published in 1917, contains no direct mention of conflict, nor do any of her stories during this era. Only in the subtext of metaphors does armed violence erupt. Words are like hand grenades and shrapnel. The hand grenade metaphor also appeared in a 1918 story, and rain is in that story compared to shrapnel in another 1918 story. Perhaps the metaphors took her unaware, for Aldrich consciously dedicated herself to the belief that people read to escape, and that as a writer she should offer an enjoyable respite from war's horrors. It was a principle of literary nonviolence, one might say, a principle Aldrich retained throughout her career. Years later, she explained to an editor she could not believe that during war people wanted to read about conflict in their leisure time. And this was during World War II, when she was quite unable to write stories. They wanted her to write another book that would take people's minds, they said, off the war. And she said, "I cannot write. I don't want to write about it." They wanted to talk about a woman whose husband, well, much like this, whose grandfather, husband, son, and grandchildren had been in the wars as they progressed through our history. And she said she couldn't do it, and she didn't do it. She did not write another book. An observer of life and people, Aldrich recognized that much of life is lived through feelings. She said that, quote, "My type of story is a story of emotion rather than of intellect. I try to make the reader feel." She also wanted to promote understanding of rural lives by her urban readers. Aldrich lived and wrote in a village, and her stories ring with the life of small towns, the Kensingtons, which were church women's groups, the school activities, the functions and celebrations that were combined efforts of all the townspeople, and the sense of personal history that each had about each other. In her stories, Aldrich is protective of and supportive of those who remain on the farms. Her message is that farmers were becoming and are becoming well-educated, and often may be college graduates, and that the wives are as chic and up-to-date as their urban sisters. One reason her work was so in demand was that she offered her readers the feeling of the country, the best of their memories of rural homes that they had known or that they had imagined. As one editor wrote to Aldrich, he and his wife were, quote, "small-town folks. The cities are full of us. You don't merely create characters, you create people with whom we are familiar," unquote. And at that time, that was when the great migration from the farm to the cities was going on. And so many of the people who were living in the urban areas had strong roots to the small towns, the villages, to the farms about which she wrote. Aldrich was a fighter for what she believed in, although somewhat of a velvet-gloved fighter, and there was little that could raise her ire as quickly as someone insulting her beloved Midwest, which she invariably defended. Aldridge believed in the farmers and the villagers and in their lives, knew that they experienced the same emotion as their urban relatives, and, while recognizing that they were not perfect either, wrote of them with respect and with affection. She was always conscious of the distinction that a choice of language makes, and she rejected academic classifications and described herself as a realist, explaining that sentiment, when she said sentiment, she meant emotion, was a part of reality. Quote, "Sentiment doesn't lie in the soil or in the climate or in the latitude or longitude. It lies in the hearts of people. Wherever there are folk who live and work and love and die, whether they raise hogs in Iowa or oranges in California or the sails of a pleasure boat at Palm Beach, there is the stuff of which stories are made." My own label for Aldridge's writing is romantic realist, for she was a writer who affirmed the goodness that exists in everyday living. Even in these early years as a writer, Aldridge was firm in her principles, but she never felt it her duty to force her ideas on others. She offered her thoughts and words as possibilities or example, but she let each choose his or her own path. She was consistent in her ideals. One of her favorite topics is teachers of her era. She was, Bess Streeter Aldrich graduated from what we now know as the University of Northern Iowa. In the early days, when Aldridge was going there, or she was Bess Streeter then, not Aldridge, in the early days it was Iowa State Normal School. And she graduated from that with a degree in education, in I suppose we'd call it probably 1 through 8, something like that. She was a primary school teacher, so actually it wouldn't be 1 through 8 even. But she graduated with that degree, and she did teach for a while. She taught in Marshalltown, Iowa, and she taught in Boone, Iowa. It was in Marshalltown where she met her husband, by the way, her husband-to-be. She often used stories about teachers in her short stories. She uses phrases that I have a feeling were told to her by some small child. For example, on one occasion, she has one of her school teachers wearing a cameo pin. And the child said something to the effect that the cameo is as big as an ice cream cone. And you know that that had to be something that someone said to her, because you don't make that kind of thing up. And so she uses teachers a lot. She also uses the school Whittier in several of her short stories, and also in 1 or 2 of her novels the name Whittier School will appear. The reason for this is that her cousin, Miss Louise Barrett, who was a full generation older than Aldridge, but who came back to get her master's degree while Aldridge was getting her undergraduate degree, provided a lot of help about various things in early Iowa for Bess Streeter Aldrich when she was writing. So often when Aldridge would use a school, it would be Whittier School. She occasionally uses Lafayette School, which was the one in Salt Lake City in which she taught for 1 year. If I were to be talking to Mrs. Aldrich face to face, and I would say Mrs. Aldrich, she was brought up in a very Victorian era. It was the end of the era, but she was Victorian, and Victoriana remained in the small towns, whereas it went out of New York City or Boston much earlier. But the small towns retained it. She was a Victorian lady. When I've talked to people in Elmwood who knew her as little children, they would say Mrs. Aldrich this and Mrs. Aldrich that. Now sometimes they would talk about their friends' mothers as Aunt so-and-so, but nobody called Mrs. Aldrich Aunt so-and-so. She was Mrs. Aldrich, and that was simply her name. Now, people were not in awe of Mrs. Aldrich there. They respected her, they liked her, yet she was a very down-to-earth person. I have a great deal of respect for her as a human being. If she had troubles, and she had troubles because her husband died and left her a widow with 4 small children, the oldest was the girl who was 14, but the youngest was only 4 years old, and there was no Social Security in those days, nothing to help a bereaved, widowed mother raise those children. So I have a great deal of respect for what she did, how she went ahead with her life and wrote her stories. And she wrote even though she wasn't sure she would be able to, because her husband was gone and he'd been very supportive of her work. But I would be very respectful of Mrs. Aldrich. I would also think we would have a lot to talk about. She never complained. People said she never complained. They were also kind of glad to be able to say she was enough a town person that sometimes her slip showed. I've had several people tell me that it was really kind of nice to know that her slip could show. But they also would say if her shoes were muddy, she took them off before she came into your house, and she was just like anybody else. And the shoe man down there said that he always knew when she brought shoes in that he was going to have a lot of work to do, because she wore her shoes, she wore her clothes as long as she could before she had them repaired. So she was a very fine lady. Her children could only remember seeing her mad on a couple of occasions, one of which was when one of her sons apparently had some run-in with the football coach, and she went up there and talked to him, and her son told me when she came back her cheeks were quite pink. But they have no idea what she said or what he said. And the other time she was angry and she wrote a letter to the Elmwood newspaper about it, and it was picked up by the wire services and carried nationwide, was when a dog poisoner was loose in Elmwood and poisoned every dog but one. And that was because that dog was sleeping in his master's bedroom that night. It was a boy across the street. And the Aldridges lost their dog too. And she said he was dirty and he was smelly and he had fleas, but we loved him. And nobody had the right to do that. I think that one of the things that Mrs. Aldridge would say if somebody asked her, what should I write about? How do I know what to write? She would say, and I would echo it 100%, write about the things you know best. Mrs. Aldridge spoke of one time when she was trying to sell a story, and it was about a wealthy New England woman. Well, as a matter of fact, she finally did sell a story, but it took quite a while before she did. And she later said, I had no idea what a wealthy New England woman was like. I didn't know any wealthy women, and I certainly had never been to New England. So she said that story just did not work very well and did not sell very easily. So write about the things you know best, the things that you understand, and don't worry about the money, because if you write well enough and if you're also lucky, the material will sell if that's what you want to do with it. Lots of people want to write and they don't care if it sells, and it's not necessarily important, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're good if you sell, and it doesn't mean that you're not good if you don't sell. People need to write because it's good for them as a person. One of the things, because Aldridge has been so important, and once again, Sue also encouraged me to write about Aldridge. When I told her that I had been asked to do this, she said, what a wonderful thing. And she was one of the people that kept putting Mrs. Aldridge in my way, by the way. But when I started writing about her, I had no idea where all this would take me. I have met people from Chadron, from Paxton, from Ogallala, from Norfolk, from every part of the state, from Auburn, who are all interested in Aldridge and want to know and to hear about Mrs. Aldridge. And so in part I want to continue talking about Mrs. Aldridge and letting them know. I've also gone over to Iowa and given talks over in Iowa about Mrs. Aldridge. I have some other possibilities for books, for biographies, or another one which would not be a biography. And when I retire from writing biographies and other kinds of things, I'm going to go ahead and finish the novel that I was writing. And I have also given talks at, for example, the College of St. Mary's and places like that to people who want to write. I taught writing a semester at Fremont Midland. And so helping other people learn to write perhaps in the way I did, I would like to think that I was doing that, as well as keeping Mrs. Aldridge's word going ahead. Bess Streeter Aldrich's husband died in church. He had gone to church with the children, except for one son who had left his cap over at the tennis court. And so she had said, you cannot go to Sunday school and church until you've gone and got your cap. Well, he somehow never got back. Stopped and played someplace else, apparently. And then they'd had Sunday school, and he was Sunday school superintendent there of the church. It was the Methodist church there. And Mary Eleanor had come home to help her mother with dinner, and Bess had stayed home that day because they were expecting company, and Cap had recently been diagnosed as having diabetes. So she was preparing a special meal for him. I didn't know that they knew that much about, I guess you'd say, excuse me, the importance of nutrition or diet for a diabetic at that time, and apparently they did. Anyway, she was home making a special meal for him as well as the dinner for the guests who would be coming later. And they came and got her in the car and told her that Cap had been taken ill, and it wasn't until she got to church, or just before she got to church, that they found out that he had died. Now, the newspaper at the time said he died of a heart attack. However, Mary Aldridge Beechner has since told me that it was a cerebral hemorrhage. Dr. Liston, who was the town doctor there, his nurse was there in the choir, and he was sitting in the pew that the Aldrich family always sat in with the two boys who were with him. And she said all of a sudden he put both hands to his head and then fell over. And that was it. So she had sent her family off, happy, usual type family, and within 2 hours she had become a widow, and with not much support. And it was a terrible shock. And she said that she made herself an iron house and just lived in it for a while so she could get over the shock. And she said she felt bitter because she said, I see men standing leaning against storefront windows whittling, of no earthly good to themselves or anybody else. And here was this man who was so fine. He was a physician and a minister to the needs of our community. And he might not give somebody a loan out in the front at his cashier desk, but he would take them in the back, and he would give them a loan if they needed it, and he felt that they were, somebody who was really going to pay it back, or maybe didn't always get paid back, but was worthy of whatever they needed the money for. And she said he did so much good, and here he has to be taken while these idlers just stand around. And she said, very bitter for a while, but I think she got over it. She did not miss a time in her day journal, and she kept a day book, by the way, which had very little material really in it, but every anniversary of his death, which I believe was May 25th, May 24th, 1925, she noted, today Cap has been gone so many years. I think they had a very close relationship. She finally, some years later, after his death, she wrote and said that she thought that she should be given a pension, and she got $34 a month for several months. It was very hard after her husband died. She sold her husband's law books to a Judge Beeson for $84 or something like that. There was just not much help, and she did own a part of the bank, which in good years was helpful, but it was not always good years. And in the Depression, and this I will tell you, I think folks should know about this. In the Depression, Bess Streeter Aldrich saved the bank in Elmwood, Nebraska. She was still a part owner of the bank, and right after Roosevelt was sworn in, you may recall, some of you, or you've read it in your history books, that Roosevelt sent bank auditors throughout the country, although I found since that there were some out in the western part of our state who never got audited, which I think is such fun. At any rate, he sent auditors out throughout the country to check the banks, and those that were not going to be solvent could not reopen. Well, the American Exchange Bank had bought some South American paper in good faith. They knew when they bought it that it was all right paper. When the Depression hit, that was among the kinds of paper that was no longer good. So she knew that the bank was not going to be able to reopen because of this. So she went to the state banking director, George W. Woods, and she said, "Tell me how much is owed, and I will give you that amount of money." And she said, "If more should be needed later, I will supply that amount too." And she went to what her daughter called her tin box. Now, what she took out of that, I don't know. I have no idea if she had possibly government bonds that still had some value. I don't know if she had jewelry. I've never had a sense that Mrs. Aldridge wore great quantities of jewelry. I have no idea what was in that box. Whatever it was enough to take care of the amount that the bank needed. She made just one stipulation, and that was that no one was to know about her part in keeping the American Exchange Bank open until after her death. She didn't want anybody to know, and it didn't come out until 7 years after she died. But she said she couldn't, she was working on Miss Bishop at the time, and you'll see, if you read Miss Bishop, you will see reflections of the financial problems of the time in there. She said she couldn't go on with the writing of the book, knowing that friends and neighbors could lose houses, farms, stores in town, because they all had money on loan from the American Exchange Bank, and they would have been foreclosed. So they would have lost everything. I think perhaps the thing that most impresses me about Bess Streeter Aldrich is her modesty. She was, well, she didn't want people to know about the bank. That's pretty modest. She could have got, I mean, think of the books that she could have sold when Miss Bishop came out. Think of the headlines. Aldridge saves bank, writes book, you know, about the story of, well, it's not quite the story, but they could have done wonderful things with that. She could have sold a jillion. And in those days, she was very upset because of the Depression. The book was not selling as well as her others, and she needed the money. You know, she needed the money. One of the things she said along those same lines was that she felt that writing and money should not be oil and water. She said, I think we should write like inspired artists and sell like true Yankees. And I always liked that. But she didn't go about making a big deal of herself. I think we've about run out of time. Well, thank you. I've certainly enjoyed being here, and I've enjoyed all of you, and you all had such interested looks on your face, and if that doesn't inspire a speaker, nothing will.